You wake up in the middle of a humid, mildew-scented cottage in 1324. It's spring, probably. You assume, because the smell of manure has changed from fermenting to aggressively joyful. Also, your face is stuck to the straw pillow again. You sit up, and you're greeted with the usual bouquet of sensations: itchy woolen blanket, a rat nibbling on your shoe, and a dull ache in your kidneys that's probably from sleeping on a slanted plank. That's your bed. A board. No mattress, no duvet, no feather pillow, and certainly no memory foam. Just a board and some hay that smells like goat. You drag yourself up, slowly. Your knees crack like a late harvest. You groan. The rat also groans. It's annoyed that you interrupted its breakfast. And as you shuffle toward the wooden door, ducking beneath a support beam that's somehow lower than yesterday, you catch a whiff of something floral, sweet, almost medicinal. That's weird. That's suspicious. That's deeply concerning. Because in this charming medieval fever dream of a life, flowers aren't cute. Flowers are a warning. So before you get too cozy in your straw mattress of disappointment, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're actually enjoying this gentle stroll through historical discomfort. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love to see if anyone's trying to fall asleep at 3 a.m. in Antarctica or mid-commute in New York. Either way, we're in this weirdly educational nap spiral together. Now, let's talk about those flowers. Not the roses. Roses had decent PR back then. But let's say you see a bunch of bright blue monkshood near your neighbor's door. Or maybe some blooming foxglove growing a little too close to your stew pot. Or, heaven forbid, you find a bundle of yellow tansy hanging ominously above your baby's crib. Congratulations. You might be cursed. Or dying. Or both. In the Middle Ages, flowers weren't romantic. They were rarely for decoration. In fact, a good number of them were seen as the botanical equivalent of a murder confession. Some flowers meant death. Some were used to cause death. And others were, quite literally, early warning signs that someone in your village was dabbling in witchcraft, herbal medicine, or both, which, by the way, were often considered the same thing. Now, you might be wondering, why were people so terrified of flowers? Aren't they just plants with commitment issues? Great question. Yes, but no. See, in medieval Europe, people didn't just avoid certain flowers. They whispered about them, blamed them, feared them. Sometimes they even burned entire fields of them. Not because they were superstitious peasants with too much time on their hands, although, yes, but because flowers had power. Poisonous power, religious power, reproductive power. And nothing terrifies a medieval person more than unexplained reproductive power. Imagine this. You're a 14th century peasant with the immune system of a moth and access to approximately 3 facts about how the human body works. You see someone boiling some belladonna in a cauldron. What do? You don't ask questions. You panic. Because belladonna isn't just any flower. It's deadly nightshade. And if someone's making tea out of that, they're either trying to commune with demons, treat an eye infection, or poison the Lord's wine. And you do not want to be part of any of those scenarios. This is how flowers became medieval red flags. Let's start with foxglove. It's tall. It's lovely. It looks like it belongs on the cover of a cottagecore Spotify playlist. But in medieval Europe, foxglove was the plant of choices. Specifically, the kind of choices that made your heart beat like a hummingbird before it stopped altogether. Foxglove is the source of digitalis, a chemical that affects heart rhythm. Today, we use it in medication. Back then, it was used in potions, healing tonics, and also, very quietly, in murder. Because if you needed to give someone a heart attack that looked natural, foxglove was your girl. Now, did they know what digitalis was? Absolutely not. They just knew this flower did weird things to your pulse. It was like herbal roulette. You might feel better. You might see your ancestors. You might die in the privy. And heaven help you if you were a woman seen picking foxglove alone. That was basically a confession to being a hedge witch, a healer, sure, but the kind that would either fix your gout or turn your cow inside out, depending on her mood. Then there was monkshood, aconitum, wolfsbane. Pick a name, all of them sound like an indie band or a minor demon. This flower was feared. Why? Because it was murder in leaf form. A drop of monkshood in your wine, and it's good night forever. Your nerves shut down. Your heart slows to a medieval crawl. And, bonus, your mouth goes numb, which probably made it the flower of choice for assassins who wanted their victims to die quietly. And yet, monks kept it in their gardens. Why? Because it was also used to treat headaches. Yes, the same plant that can stop your heart was used to soothe your migraines. Medieval logic is just vibes and desperation. Let's not forget about tansy. Tansy was the ultimate paradox. On one hand, it was used in spring feasts to cleanse the body after a winter of salted meat and regret. On the other hand, it was known to terminate pregnancies. Yes, medieval women, those crafty, unacknowledged geniuses, figured out that this bright yellow flower could be used for herbal abortions, which meant that any woman caught gaggering or brewing tansy could be accused of witchcraft, murder, or just being suspiciously alive. Let's pause here. You might be thinking, wow, medieval Europe sounds like a horrifying episode of botanical CSI. And you'd be right. But it wasn't just about poison. Flowers were also seen as signs, omens. Some were planted on graves to mark the dead. Others were burned in smoke rituals. A few were literally nailed to doors to ward off spirits, sickness, or nosy neighbors. Lavender, for instance, wasn't just a relaxing scent. It was crammed into pillows to ward off lice. And if your pillow smelled too strongly of lavender, people might wonder why you were protecting yourself so aggressively. What did you have to hide? Plague? Witchcraft? A really unfortunate haircut? And don't get me started on rue. Rue was everywhere in medieval Europe. It was used to protect against the evil eye, repel insects, and induce vomiting. It was the multitool of plants. So naturally, people respected it, and feared it, and also avoided people who smelled like it because it meant either you were healing or you were hexing. Even common herbs had double lives. Sage wasn't just for stuffing your imaginary turkey. It was a symbol of wisdom and immortality. So if you were seen hoarding sage, people might assume you were trying to become immortal, or at least smugly educated. Both crimes in the average medieval village. Here's something especially fun. Certain flowers were so closely associated with death and illness that entire laws were passed about them. For example, in some parts of Europe, planting monkshood near your neighbor's land could be considered a threat. A botanical middle finger. And if someone died mysteriously after you had handled certain flowers, well, you'd better have a very good alibi and zero warts. Warts were basically evidence. Now let's talk about smell. Because medieval Europe smelled like suffering. Between the open sewage, the rotting meat, and the overwhelming scent of never-bathed flowers stood out. Too much floral smell could be interpreted as suspicious. Why were you trying to mask the scent? What were you hiding? Were you sick? Contagious? Full of secrets and nightshade? This wasn't just paranoia. In a world where disease traveled faster than gossip and hygiene was optional, smells mattered. A sudden floral scent could mean someone was covering the smell of death. Literally, corpses were sometimes packed with herbs and flowers to mask decomposition. So if you smelled too much lavender, someone might be dead. Possibly you, soon. Even churches got in on the paranoia. Some monasteries banned certain plants from their gardens. Not because they were toxic, but because monks were starting to experiment. Herbal experimentation often meant, oops, Brother Anselm summoned a demon again. And nothing ruins a Vespers service like unexpected demonic possession. So yes, in the Middle Ages, flowers were beautiful, dangerous, useful, and always suspicious. You couldn't trust them. You couldn't ignore them. And you definitely couldn't grow them without getting side-eyed by your neighbors. It wasn't about beauty. It was about survival. Flowers could heal you, poison you, protect you, or get you burned at the stake. Sometimes all four. In the same week. You sit by the hearth now, staring into the fire, sipping something that's supposed to be herbal tea but tastes like pond water and decisions. A bouquet of something purple and vaguely poisonous sits on the windowsill. Your neighbor put it there. You don't know if it's a gift, or a threat, or both. You sip the tea again. It's bitter. And now your mouth is tingling. Welcome to the medieval garden. Nothing's just a flower. You're still in the cottage. Still alive, probably. The tingling in your mouth turned out to be a beetle. Not poison. So, you win this round. Outside, it's dawn, or as close to dawn as it gets when your only clock is a rooster who's both confused and aggressively punctual. The air is damp and smells like wet bark, soot, and something vaguely fungal. You step out, cautiously, because you're still not sure what that flower on your windowsill meant. Was it a polite hello? A symbol of respect? A warning that someone's plotting your demise using plants and passive aggression? You see, in the medieval world, flowers weren't just feared for their poison. They were also steeped in meaning, symbolism, allegory. A single bloom could be the botanical equivalent of a loaded crossbow, or a wedding ring, or a very polite "go away and die." Medieval people didn't just look at flowers. They read them, not in the relaxing, tea-sipping Victorian language of flowers kind of way that came much later, with lace gloves and passive courtship. No, this was more medieval, which means more suspicious, more ominous, more likely to involve plague. So before you pick that innocent-looking bouquet someone left by your door, let's take a journey into the symbolic minefield that was medieval flower gifting. Just know that by the end of this walk, you'll be slightly more paranoid and definitely less enthusiastic about florists. Let's begin with the most innocent-looking offender, daisies. Daisies were everywhere. They were associated with innocence, purity, and other things medieval people rarely had the luxury of experiencing. But here's the twist: daisies were also placed on children's graves. Not because they were comforting, but because the child was pure and had returned to heaven unsullied. So if someone handed you a daisy and looked too solemn, you had to wonder, were they complimenting your purity or implying your time on earth was up? Then we have marigolds. Today, they're vibrant, cheery, little rays of orange hope. In the Middle Ages, not so much. Marigolds were symbols of grief and despair. They were often planted near graveyards or used in mourning rituals. If you received marigolds from someone, it meant one of two things: they were praying for your soul or hoping they'd need to, soon. And then there's columbine. Not the tragic modern association, but the medieval one. This delicate flower was linked to sadness, betrayal, and cuckoldry. Yes, cuckoldry. If someone handed you a sprig of columbine, they might as well have said, "Your spouse is cheating and everyone knows but you." Romantic, right? Now, if you were really unlucky, someone might send you a bundle of flowers laced with wormwood. Ah yes, wormwood, bitter, medicinal, and the inspiration for absinthe. In medieval symbolism, wormwood represented loss, bitterness, and the harsh reality of repentance. If you found wormwood in your bouquet, it wasn't subtle. Someone thought you needed to suffer for your sins, or just your personality. Even the humble violet wasn't safe. Sure, violets symbolize humility and modesty, two traits the medieval church loved to advertise and never actually practice. But violets were also used in funeral garlands. So once again, someone gives you violets, and you're left wondering whether it's a compliment or a preemptive condolence card. And let's not forget the crown jewel of toxic misunderstandings, lily of the valley. This one is small, white, and sweet-smelling. It looks like it belongs in a bridal bouquet. But surprise! It's highly poisonous. Every part of it. In fact, it's toxic enough that even touching it too much can mess with your heart rhythm. But it also symbolized the return of happiness. So people used it for weddings, religious offerings, and festive occasions. Basically, everyone was out there smiling and dying slowly, because no one thought to question why happiness smelled like cardiac arrest. Imagine attending a wedding, receiving a corsage made of lily of the valley, and thinking, "Ah, how lovely." Meanwhile, your pulse is doing the Macarena, and you're about to collapse into the goose pie. Still, symbolism mattered, especially in the church. Medieval monks, bless their sheltered little hearts, went absolutely feral with floral metaphors. Roses became associated with martyrdom. White lilies were the symbol of the Virgin Mary's purity, which, considering lilies are extremely fertile and toxic, is probably the most ironically on-brand symbol choice in ecclesiastical history. There were even entire books, bestiaires and florilegia, that explained flowers in theological terms. Ivy meant fidelity. Thistles meant hardship. Poppies meant sleep and death, which frankly, still checks out. These meanings filtered into sermons, artwork, stained glass windows, and passive-aggressive monastery decorations. In noble courts, things got even weirder. Nobles loved to send talking bouquets. That's right. Arranged bundles of meaning. Not based on beauty, but based on coded messages. Like botanical text messages. Except you could literally die if you misinterpreted one. For instance, red rose plus white rose plus black poppy. I love you, but if you cheat on me, I will haunt you from the grave. Cute. Of course, if you were literate, and let's be honest, you weren't, you might be able to consult a herbal or bestiary and figure out what the flowers meant. But since 95% of medieval people couldn't read, most of the knowledge was oral. Passed down from old women, herbalists, traveling peddlers, or that one guy in the village who claimed he could speak to birds. Half of it was real. Half of it was superstition. All of it was taken very seriously. This meant that even accidental flower arrangements could trigger drama. Imagine you're a humble peasant. You pick some flowers for your crush. You include a few columbines because they look nice. Next thing you know, her father is challenging you to a duel because you just accused his daughter of cheating on her betrothed. And all you wanted to do was flirt. With plants. It gets worse. In certain regions, flower arrangements were also used as evidence in witchcraft trials. If someone saw you carrying a bundle of herbs associated with death or fertility, you might end up in a pond with your limbs tied, waiting to see if you float. And if you did float, congratulations. You're a witch. If you didn't, well, you're dead, but innocent. Justice. This is how deeply flower symbolism ran. It wasn't just decoration. It was identity. It was your soul on a stalk. A single wrong petal, and you could ruin your reputation, your family, or your entire ability to not be burned at the stake. And you thought modern dating was hard. Even childbirth wasn't immune. Expecting mothers were sometimes given specific flowers to protect the baby, or, ominously, to ease the burden if something went wrong. A bundle of mugwort, for example, was believed to protect against evil spirits during labor. But too much mugwort? That was associated with death and hallucination. So again, you had to trust that the herbalist wasn't just winging it. And don't assume this flower language nonsense was only for the wealthy or the clergy. Common folk knew these symbols too. They had to. When you live in a world where literally everything from weather to your neighbor's goat can be interpreted as an omen, you learn to read the signs. Especially the ones that grow out of the dirt and look suspiciously cheerful. Now, you sit in the garden, if you can call it that. A small patch of struggling herbs, one aggressive goose, and a few wildflowers you didn't plant. You eye a cluster of feverfew growing near the fence. Used for treating headaches. But also a symbol of sorrow and protection. You leave it alone. You're not taking any chances. Behind you, the wind rustles the tansy drying from your rafters. Yellow, bright, and cursed. You made that choice. 4 reasons. But now your neighbors are whispering. Someone leaves a bundle of something wrapped in twine on your doorstep. You open it carefully. Inside, 3 marigolds, 1 sprig of rue, and a single white lily. You stare at it for a while. Then you quietly close the door. It's probably nothing. Just a message. A floral telegram from the past. One that says, "Sleep tight." You wake up again. But this time, there's a strange smell. Not the usual cocktail of stale straw, old wool, and whatever your neighbor's pig dragged through the village square last night. No, this is different. Floral, yes, but not in a delightful, springtime breeze kind of way. It's sharp, cloying, a little too sweet, like something pretending to be pleasant. Like a perfume made by someone who has never actually smelled a flower and based the whole recipe on a fever dream. You sit up and immediately regret it. There's a sprig of something tucked into the crevice of your pillow. Pale purple, frilly, suspicious, lavender. At first, you think, hey, that's nice. You've read somewhere, or rather, overheard in the bakery queue, that lavender is supposed to help with sleep, or maybe ward off moths, or sadness, or rats. The list is unclear, mostly because no one in your village has agreed on anything since the moon fell behind the clouds last November and the local priest declared it a sign of God's silent displeasure. But as you stare at the lavender, something shifts in your brain. That creeping medieval fear seeps in again. Not about death. Not about poison. Not even about social ostracism, which, let's face it, is a given at this point. No, this is something darker. More metaphysical. You've heard the stories. You've heard that if you inhale the wrong flower at the wrong time, with the wrong posture, on the wrong day of the lunar cycle, you might accidentally let something in. Not a mouse, not a fever, but something worse. A demon. Welcome to the weird and wonderful medieval belief that certain flowers, especially fragrant ones, could literally act as spiritual gateways. Little aromatic portals. For evil. So before you lean in to take a deep whiff of your garden, let's talk about the theology of sniffing. Yes, that was a real concern. Let's start with the basics. Medieval medicine believed in the doctrine of signatures. It's the idea that God, or whatever cosmic force you were avoiding offending this week, left clues in the natural world about which plants healed what ailments. Red plants were for blood. Yellow ones for jaundice. Kidney-shaped leaves? You guessed it. Those were for kidneys. Sounds logical-ish, right? Sort of cute, in a naive, spiritual scavenger hunt kind of way. But when it came to smell, things got complicated. See, the nose was believed to be a doorway. Not just into your body, but into your soul. Medieval people thought that smells didn't just linger in your nostrils, they entered you, became part of you, changed you, possibly forever. Good smells, like frankincense, lavender, and rose, were considered purifying. They could uplift the spirit, repel evil, and even bring you closer to God. Monks burned herbs in their cloisters not just because they were trying to hide the odor of centuries-old mildew, but because they believed that sweet smells could sanctify the space. It was a holy olfactory experience. Ode to benediction. But here's the flip side. Bad smells were the devil's playground. The idea of miasma, literally bad air, was the prevailing theory of how disease spread. Forget germs. Those weren't invented yet. No, if you got sick, people assumed it was because you'd walked through some cursed fog. A whiff of putrid air. Maybe from a swamp. Or a plague pit. Or your cousin Roger, who hasn't bathed since last Pentecost. This fear extended to smells from plants. Especially strong, unfamiliar ones. Too much sweet perfume? Suspicious. Why? Because it could cause spiritual confusion. Theologians actually debated this. They believed that certain flowers could bewitch the senses, overstimulate the spirit, confuse the soul into mistaking artificial ecstasy for divine grace, which, in their minds, left you vulnerable, open, like a medieval pop-up ad saying, "Your soul is unprotected. Download sin now." And who loved an unguarded soul? Demons. They weren't always the Hollywood kind, either. No horns and fire. More like invisible nuisances. Mischievous spirits. Shadows that crept in through your nose and made you dream strange dreams. Or think sinful thoughts. Or become unusually obsessed with butter. People reported all kinds of symptoms after inhaling suspect florals. Fever. Lethargy. Hallucinations. Sometimes possession. But not always dramatic, head-spinning possession. No, more like the subtle kind, where you start forgetting prayers. Or you suddenly curse in the middle of Sunday Mass and don't know why. Or you dream of your dead grandmother dancing in a field of poppies and wake up convinced she wants you to steal a goose. That kind of thing. So to protect yourself, you had to be strategic. Herbal manuals from the time often included spiritual advice alongside botanical notes. For example, if you had to work with a pungent flower like hellebore or mandrake, you were advised to wear a protective charm. Say a prayer. Or at the very least, avoid inhaling too deeply. One medical text from the 13th century recommended holding your breath while harvesting certain roots. Not because of toxins, but because the root spirit may enter your mind and replace it. Charming. Let's pause here for a moment and reflect on what this means for your average medieval flower picker. You're out in the forest looking for herbs. You're alone, obviously, because your village thinks you're weird. You spot a patch of sweet-smelling flowers. But you hesitate, because if you inhale too deeply, you might let something in. You try not to breathe. You pluck the stem. You mutter a prayer under your breath. You run back home with your bouquet like it's a live grenade. That's what herbalism looked like. Still want to be a medieval healer? Let's talk about poppies. Poppies were widely used in medieval medicine, especially for sleep. The sap from unripe poppy heads was made into something called the sleeping draught, an early, rudimentary opiate. It worked. Kind of. It knocked people out. Sometimes permanently. But poppies weren't just medicinal. They were mystical. People believed that inhaling too much of their scent could induce not just sleep, but dreams from the other world, messages from the dead, visions of angels, or, more worryingly, visions of false angels. And that's how you ended up with poppies being banned in some monasteries. Not because of the drugs, but because of the theological risk. You might dream of heaven, or you might dream of something that looked like heaven, but wasn't. And if you woke up thinking a demon in a feathered head had told you to start a cult in your basement, that was on you. Mandrake is another one. A deeply aromatic root used for all sorts of things, from fertility potions to pain relief to amateur necromancy. The smell was said to be both alluring and dangerous. Too much of it? Madness. Or worse. Medieval lore insisted that the mandrake screamed when uprooted. Literally screamed. Loud enough to kill anyone who heard it. This wasn't just superstition. It was procedure. You were supposed to tie the mandrake to a dog and let it pull the root out while you covered your ears. The dog would die, but you'd survive. Hopefully. This practice was written down, copied, passed around in medical texts, because flower-screaming fatality was a recognized workplace hazard. Now let's not forget the church's role in all of this. Medieval clergy were deeply suspicious of floral smells that induce pleasure, especially among women. They worried that flowers might inflame the senses, which, in priest-speak, means make you have impure thoughts about the blacksmith. Fragrant herbs like myrtle, hyacinth, or even certain varieties of rose were sometimes restricted from convents. Nuns were warned not to grow too many sweet-smelling plants in their gardens, lest they become distracted from divine contemplation. Yes, Sister Agnes, your lavender sachet is making you think about kissing. Please go flagellate yourself and plant onions instead. All of this culminated in a kind of floral paranoia. Flowers weren't just decoration. They were potential threats. Spiritual landmines. Olfactory agents of chaos. So what did people do? They burned things. A lot. Incense, sage, rosemary, anything considered cleansing. Smoke was seen as a purifier. A way to push out the bad spirits, neutralize the dangerous aromas, and reset the spiritual balance of a space. You'd walk into a medieval home and it might smell like burnt thyme and goat, and that was intentional. Better smoky than possessed. Back in your cottage, you gently remove the lavender from your pillow. You place it in a jar, but you leave the lid off, just in case. Outside, the sky is dark again, because you lost track of time. Again, the moon is peeking through the clouds, and the wind smells faintly of chamomile. You wonder, just for a moment, what it would mean if you inhaled too deeply. And then you close the window, because sometimes, in the medieval world, it's best not to sniff the wrong thing. You wake up in a different room this time. A bit nicer. The straw on your bed doesn't smell like it died screaming. The walls are whitewashed and someone's tried to sweep. There's even a window, though it's mostly for show, because it's currently covered in pigskin stretched over the opening like a medieval version of frosted glass. That's right, welcome to luxury. You sit up, your back cracking like an old church pew, and notice something unusual. A bouquet. A neat, well-arranged little bundle of blooms placed lovingly in a clay vase beside your cot. It's tied with a thin bit of string, and the water is fresh. Someone cares. But when you lean closer, your face changes. The flowers smell faintly bitter. Medicinal. A little angry. And that's when it hits you. These aren't here to cheer you up. They're here to keep you alive. Or possibly kill you faster. In the medieval world, that was often a fine line. Welcome to Chapter 4 of your sleepy descent into historical horticultural horror, where we explore the flowers so toxic, so misunderstood, or so demonically rumored that just looking at them sideways was enough to earn a bad dream or an exorcism. These are the botanical overachievers that made medieval people nervously clutch their rosaries and mutter Latin in the garden. Let's begin, shall we? Meet the first contestant in our floral death pageant, Wolfsbane, also known as monkshood. Sounds nice, doesn't it? Monkish. Serene. Something you'd expect to see in a monastery herbarium growing next to the mint and the celery. Wrong. This plant was basically the nuclear option of medieval botany. Highly toxic, beautiful in a don't-touch-me kind of way, and famously used to poison wolves. Hence the name. One whiff or taste of this thing and you could look forward to numbness, slowed breathing, vomiting, paralysis, and a full body shutdown. It was, impressively, both a medical ingredient and a method of assassination. So why did people keep it around? Because, ironically, it was also believed to protect against evil spirits. The idea was, if something is deadly to humans, then surely it's deadly to demons too. Makes sense, right? If you're willing to drop a priest, maybe you'll scare off a few ghosts in the process. Wolfsbane was sprinkled in thresholds, worn in small sachets, or even burned to cleanse a space. You know, by releasing its lovely hallucinogenic fumes into your lungs while you pray not to forget your own name. You'd think people would stop growing it. They didn't. Because as with everything in the Middle Ages, danger and usefulness were usually a package deal. Next up, henbane. Henbane sounds like a villain in a fantasy novel, but it was real and had the delightful reputation of causing hallucinations, convulsions, and what medieval physicians like to call divine confusion. It was often used in flying ointments. Yes, flying. As in, witches' potions meant to let them defy gravity. We now know that most flying involved tripping very hard and falling into a shrub. But back then, the belief was that henbane could give you visions, lift your spirit from your body, or in some cases, summon demons you could then ask for favors. Or snacks. And yet, it also had legitimate medicinal uses. It was used to dull pain during surgery, to treat toothaches, to calm hysterics. The dosage was the key, and, spoiler alert, medieval dosing was about as accurate as a pigeon playing darts. Too little? Nothing happens. Too much? Goodbye, soul. You now belong to the forest. And still, henbane was cultivated. Carefully. Reverently. Often behind churches or in secret monastery gardens. A plant feared, respected, and occasionally blamed when Sister Margaret started speaking in tongues after catching a cold. Then there's belladonna, or, as the Italians charmingly called it, beautiful lady. This one's got range. It was used as an anesthetic, a cosmetic, a poison, a hallucinogen, basically the Renaissance equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, except instead of a corkscrew. It gave you the sensation of floating through fire while your organs tried to leave your body through your mouth. The cosmetic use was especially ironic. Women used belladonna drops to dilate their pupils because large eyes were considered attractive. It made them look more open, innocent, seductive, and also blind. Yes, blind. Because that's what happens when you casually drop neurotoxins into your eyeballs. Many noble women literally couldn't see the men they were charming. Which, frankly, probably helped. Belladonna was also associated with witchcraft. For centuries, it was thought to be an ingredient in potions and spells, often grown in secret and harvested at night. By moonlight. Naked. With a ritual knife. Because, of course, you can't just pick belladonna. You have to woo it. Let's switch gears and visit a more domestic horror, foxglove. Foxglove looks like a Disney flower. Tall, colorful, graceful. It even has a name that makes you think of woodland creatures wearing waistcoats and drinking tea. In reality, foxglove is one of the most potent cardiac poisons known to history. A single leaf can cause nausea, hallucinations, irregular heartbeat, and, if you're lucky, death that looks peaceful but actually involves quite a lot of internal confusion. In medieval times, it was used cautiously, if at all. But like the others, it walked that fine line between healing and homicide. Because foxglove contains compounds that, in microscopic doses, can actually regulate the heart. So naturally, medieval physicians, with their famously steady hands and precise measurement tools, read a spoon, thought they could manage that. Spoiler, they often could not. Patients either felt slightly better or never felt anything again. Now let's address mandrake. Again. Because this plant deserves its own haunting encore. We covered the whole screaming thing. But let's go deeper. Mandrake wasn't just toxic. It was legendary. It looked vaguely human, roots splitting into what looked like legs, arms, a little root body. People believed it had feelings. That it cried out when injured. That its cries could kill. So why would anyone dig it up? Because it was also believed to have miraculous properties. A properly harvested mandrake root, cleaned, wrapped in silk, and stored with reverence, was said to cure infertility, bring luck, repel demons, and even whisper secrets to the owner in their dreams. Like Alexa, but evil. To harvest it safely, you had to follow a precise ritual. Draw a magic circle around the plant. Offer a prayer or sacrifice, sometimes blood. Plug your ears with wax. Tie the root to a dog. Walk away. The dog pulls the plant. The dog dies. You collect the mandrake and try to live with your choices. And you thought getting avocados was complicated. Lastly, let's not forget the humble yew tree. Yes, it's not a flower. But medieval folks treated it like one, bundling its leaves in floral arrangements and even placing clippings in homes during certain festivals. Why? Because yew trees were sacred. They grew in graveyards. They were set to guard the dead. Some believed yews were planted to prevent spirits from wandering. The tree's aura was one of both reverence and low-level fear. You respected the yew. You didn't ask questions. You definitely didn't climb it. But the leaves, bark, and berries? All toxic. In small amounts, stomach issues. In larger amounts, cardiac failure. Children often died from yew berries. Animals avoided it. Except goats. Because goats don't care about death. Despite this, people still used yew branches in rituals, wreaths, and house decorations, especially during winter festivals, when everyone was a bit more superstitious and a bit less sober. The moral of all this? In medieval Europe, your bouquet wasn't just a nice table centerpiece. It was a gamble, a spiritual defense system, a home remedy, a trap, a dare, a mystery. Flowers weren't innocent. They were respected, feared, worshipped, weaponized. So the next time someone hands you a bunch of wildflowers, take a moment to reflect. What would your medieval ancestors think? Probably something like, "Oh God, not again. My uncle died sniffing one of those." You lie back down. The bouquet is still beside you, the bitter smell curling lazily through the room like a sleepy ghost. You breathe it in, slowly, carefully, and drift. You wake up again, still medieval, still in your scratchy linen tunic, still in a time when coffee doesn't exist and indoor plumbing is a rich man's hallucination. And this time, you're not alone. A woman is staring at you from the far corner of the room. Her hands are stained greenish-black, and her apron has suspiciously leafy bits clinging to it. There's a basket at her feet, overflowing with petals, roots, and something that smells spicy. Maybe like cinnamon? Or old socks. It's hard to tell. She doesn't speak, just looks, judging, like she knows something you don't. You're about to ask what's going on when someone knocks. Loudly. It's the village reeve. He's not here for tea. He's here for her, the flower woman. Because in this charming slice of medieval history, picking the wrong plant at the wrong time, in the wrong place, could get you arrested. Or worse, burned alive for consorting with the devil and his leafy accomplices. Welcome to the dark, awkward underworld of medieval botanical crime. Yes, really. Because long before weed was illegal, people were already losing their heads, sometimes literally, for dabbling in herbs, roots, and flowers that society decided were suspicious. Or magical. Or just not something a woman should know that much about. Let's ease into it. In the Middle Ages, plants weren't just pretty. They were power. If you knew which herb cured fever, you had value. If you knew which plant eased labor pains, you had influence. If you could whip up a paste that helped someone sleep through their neighbor's goat screaming all night problem, you had something most people didn't. Knowledge. And that was dangerous. Especially if you were poor, female, old, or just didn't go to church enough. The line between healer and witch was thinner than a plague year soup. And often it came down to flowers. Let's begin with St. John's wort. Innocent enough. Bright yellow flowers. Cheerful. The kind of thing you might name a smoothie after. But in the Middle Ages, this flower was believed to ward off evil spirits, protect livestock from disease, and even keep witches from stealing your soul while you slept. Farmers would hang it in their stables. Mothers would tuck it into babies' cribs. Entire festivals were built around harvesting it at precisely the right time, on the eve of St. John's Day, around midsummer. But here's the kicker. If you picked it too early, you were disrupting the balance. If you picked it too late, you were tampering with fate. And if you picked it at night, without witnesses, you might as well start practicing your trial speech now, because the locals would absolutely believe you were dancing naked with demons and using it to cast love spells on married men. Fun. It was the botanical equivalent of jaywalking while holding a flaming torch and shouting, "I love Satan." And there were worse offenders. Take meadow saffron, also called autumn crocus. Beautiful. Purple. Deadly. It was known to treat gout and swelling, but the line between medicine and murder weapon was so narrow it practically didn't exist. That didn't stop people from gathering it anyway, carefully, secretly, and usually in violation of someone's land rights. Because, yes, that's the other problem. Most of the land that had medicinal plants growing on it belonged to someone richer than you. And if you wandered onto it for your herbal purposes, congratulations. You're now not just a suspected witch, but a trespasser, poacher, and potential goat thief. Even monasteries had rules about who could harvest plants and when. Some abbeys had locked gardens. Literal keys. If you weren't part of the sacred herb squad, your fingers better stay off the marjoram or Brother Gregory was reporting you to the bishop. Now, let's talk about flower theft. Because yes, that was a thing. In some towns, especially those with herb markets or apothecary guilds, stealing flowers was considered an actual crime. Not just stop that, but tie them to the stock's level of punishment. Imagine being pelted with rotten eggs because you took a few violets from a churchyard. Or worse, being accused of intending to use them for love spells. You see, medieval people were extremely nervous about intention. You didn't have to actually cast a spell. You just had to look like the kind of person who might. Like an old woman with herbs in her pockets. Or a young woman with opinions. Or, heaven forbid, someone who gave unsolicited advice about how to cure a cough. Let's pause for a moment. If you're enjoying this journey through questionable medieval flower law enforcement, this is a good time to like this video and subscribe, only if you actually enjoy what I'm doing here. And while you're at it, drop a comment below with what time it is where you are and where you're tuning in from. It always amazes me how many of you are here from every corner of the world, trying to fall asleep to obscure flower crimes. Love that for us. Now, let's go darker. Imagine you're a midwife. It's the 1300s. You've delivered more babies than you can count, all in freezing rooms with no anesthesia, and at least one nosy goat watching from the doorway. You know which flowers help with contractions. You know which ones reduce bleeding. You're a miracle worker. And then someone dies. Maybe the mother. Maybe the baby. Maybe both. Suddenly, it's your fault. And that flower tea you brewed? Now it's witch's brew. Just like that, you're under suspicion. All because you dared to know things. This happened more than you'd think. Especially during periods of religious or social upheaval. The church didn't always love independent women who had secret knowledge and close relationships with the community. And since universities were closed to women, most female healers learned through oral tradition, passed down, not written down, which meant their wisdom couldn't be verified. And so, a bouquet of daisies and chamomile became potential evidence. Even Shakespeare references this paranoia. In Hamlet, when Ophelia goes mad, she hands out flowers and herbs, each with symbolic meaning. In the medieval mind, someone walking around naming flowers and what they meant wasn't just being poetic. They were a threat. And so, entire legal systems developed around controlling who could gather what. Guilds formed. Licensed apothecaries got exclusive rights. Markets were regulated. Certain flowers, especially those associated with love, fertility, or trance states, were flat-out banned from being sold outside authorized zones. But of course, none of this stopped people from trying. Enter the flower smugglers. Yes, that's real. People would sneak into woods or private land at night to collect rare herbs and flowers, especially those thought to enhance health, virility, or spiritual protection. They'd dry them, crush them, sell them under aliases like Saint's Root or Blue Blessing. And the penalties for getting caught? Public flogging, fines, banishment, occasionally death. Imagine risking everything for a handful of dried petals. People did. Because flowers weren't just decoration. They were access to healing, to control, to secret knowledge passed down when everything else in your life was dictated by plague, patriarchy, or potatoes. And sometimes, that power was enough to get you killed. So you lie back down. The flower woman in the corner has disappeared. The basket remains. You stare at it. Carefully. You don't touch. Because now you know better. Those flowers, they're watching you too. You wake up. But this time, something's off. First of all, you're holding a flower. It's wilted, slightly damp, smells like regret and foot sweat. You're not sure how it got there. Second, the air smells sweet. Too sweet. Like someone lit 1,000 honey-scented candles and then panicked and threw in some lavender to mask the impending doom. There's a group of girls in the field next to you. They're chanting. One of them is holding a daisy and plucking the petals, slowly and dramatically. He loves me. He loves me not. He loves me. He loves me not. The rest are watching like this is the most important thing that's ever happened. And for them, it is. Because in this pocket of medieval reality, flowers don't just smell nice. They don't just make tea or get you tried for witchcraft. No. Here, flowers tell the future. Your future. Welcome to the wild and fragrant world of medieval floral divination, where plants were just as likely to decide your fate as a nobleman, the church, or the next bad harvest. It's going to get weird. Let's start with the basics. In the Middle Ages, people weren't just superstitious, they were aggressively, passionately, almost artistically superstitious. And what better medium for magical forecasting than flowers? They're pretty, mysterious, and they grow from the ground, like secrets with petals. One of the most common prophetic uses was for love magic. Which makes sense, really. When your dating pool consists of your cousin, the pig farmer's son, or that one guy who hasn't had the plague yet, you'll take whatever divine signs you can get. And flowers? They delivered. Enter the medieval daisy ritual, basically the ancient version of texting your crush and immediately regretting it. You'd pick a daisy. Start plucking petals. He loves me not. Wherever the last petal landed, that was the truth. No takebacks. Your entire romantic future, decided by a plant that goats eat when they're bored. People took this seriously. Some even cheated. They'd start with a daisy that had an odd number of petals to increase the odds of ending on he loves me. That's right, flower fraud. You weren't above it, either. Don't lie. And it didn't stop there. Many flowers were believed to bloom in response to a person's emotions. Yes, like sentient little drama queens. For example, if a primrose opened in your hand after you recited a love charm, it meant your feelings were true. If it didn't open, either you were lying, or cursed, or both. Try explaining that on a first date. But love wasn't the only thing flowers could predict. Oh no. People used plants to forecast everything from fertility to death to whether or not it was a good day to shear the sheep. One popular method was floral incubation dreams. Here's how it worked. You'd sleep with a particular flower under your pillow, usually a specific herb or blossom associated with the type of answer you wanted. Want to know if you'll marry soon? Try marjoram. Worried about a bad harvest? Maybe tuck in some mugwort. Looking for a sign that your neighbor really is cursing your cows? Betony's your best bet. You'd lie down, preferably on a straw mattress that smelled faintly of mildew and ancestral sweat, close your eyes, and hope the flower whispered the answer in your dreams. If you dreamed of rain, good omen. If you dreamed of worms, not so good. If you dreamed of being chased by a headless mun holding a tulip, therapy wasn't a thing yet. So, good luck. And don't even get me started on death flowers. Yes, those existed. Some people believed that if certain flowers bloomed out of season, it was a sign someone in the village was about to die. Others swore that if a flower grew on a grave unplanted, it meant the soul was at peace. But if the plant withered, unfinished business. Possibly haunting. Definitely drama. Of course, the church hated all of this. Why? Because people were relying on flowers instead of priests for answers. How dare? And so, floral divination was labeled pagan, heathen, or deeply suspicious, depending on which monk was scowling at the time. But it was too widespread to fully stamp out. Instead, some flowers were given safe Christian meanings. Enter the language of flowers, a moral rebranding campaign centuries before marketing departments existed. Lilies equals purity. Roses equals martyrdom. Violets equals humility. It was like giving every plant a LinkedIn profile. But people still used them for prophecies. They just didn't say it out loud. Here's a scene for you. It's midsummer. You're a young maiden with exactly 3 career options: nun, wife, or cautionary tale. You go into the woods to collect herbs for tea. But really, You're looking for yarrow. Because yarrow, when tucked under a pillow, is said to bring dreams of your future spouse. You chant the rhyme. Good morrow, good yarrow, good morrow to thee. I hope by tomorrow my true love to see. Then you lie down, swatting at insects, hoping the plant under your head doesn't cause a rash. You fall asleep, and you dream of a fishmonger. A sweaty, fish-stinking mun, with 3 teeth and a very loud laugh. You wake up screaming. But it's too late. The prophecy has been made. And now your aunt is planning the wedding. Because that's how seriously people took it. But hey, it's not all doom and death. Sometimes, flower-based predictions were used for practical things. Like weather. Red clover closing up early. Rain's coming. Dandelions staying open late. Good weather tomorrow. It's basically nature's version of a medieval weather app. No push notifications, but it didn't lie to you quite as often. Let's talk about another fan favorite, orchids. Back then, people didn't call them orchids. They had various names, some of which translate to things like munroot or testicle plant, because, well, they look like things. And people believed they could predict or influence fertility, depending on which part of the plant you used. Too much? Twin birth. Too little? Barren womb. Just right? One healthy child and an acceptable amount of marital exhaustion. Flowers weren't just metaphors for love and sex. They were tools. Calculators. Tarot cards with petals. And then there were the flower games. At fairs and festivals, young people would play games involving flower chains, blindfolds, and guessing games. Some were innocent. Others, let's just say medieval flirtation, involved a lot more sniffing than it probably should have. One particularly bizarre tradition involved young women throwing flower wreaths into streams. If it floated steadily, you'd marry soon. If it spun in a circle, heartbreak. If it sank, you guessed it, time to consider a convent. And speaking of heartbreak, some believe that flowers could quite literally show if someone had betrayed you. If your flower chain snapped unexpectedly, infidelity. If the rose you were gifted suddenly lost all its petals, your lover had eyes for another. That's right, dramatic flower-based breakups. You just know someone threw a rose at someone's head and stormed off in the 14th century, yelling, "You betrayed me, and the flowers told me first." It's beautiful, in a tragic sort of way. Of course, the elite had their own version of floral prophecy. In noble courts, bouquets were often coded. You'd receive a carefully arranged set of flowers, each symbolizing a message. A floral subtweet, if you will. Marigolds equals grief. Ivy equals fidelity. Anemones equals fading hope. Imagine getting a bouquet that reads, "I loved you once, but now I'm sad and also leaving. Have a nice plague season." Honestly, iconic. So you roll over. The flower is still in your hand. It's a violet now. Violets were associated with faithfulness and modesty, but also with death. You stare at it. It stares back. No petals are falling. Yet, you wake up again. This time, your nose twitches before your eyes even open. Something is wrong. It's not the usual medieval wrong, like fleas, famine, or a rat chewing on your shoe. No, this is a smell. A thick, gaggingly sweet, overly ambitious smell. Like 10 flower gardens exploded at once and decided to die in the same room. You blink, groggy. There are petals everywhere. Hanging from the ceiling. Tucked into corners. Shoved into cracks in the walls. And one jammed directly up your left nostril. Welcome to the 14th century equivalent of a Febreze commercial, the medieval flower market. Except here, the flowers aren't just decoration. They are your entire hygiene strategy. Because medieval people, bless them, smelled like tragedy. We're talking about a time before soap was common, before regular bathing was trusted, and before the concept of personal space had been invented. So what did they do? They turned to flowers. Flowers were the deodorant, the mouthwash, the medicine, and, if you were angry enough, the poison. Let's start with the most obvious issue, the smell. Medieval Europe was one giant olfactory disaster. Imagine the stench of unwashed humans, damp wool, spoiled fish, rotting meat, horse dung, chamber pots, and the occasional open sewer. Now imagine trying to go on a date in the middle of all that. That's where flowers came in. People would carry small bouquets, called posies or nosegays. These weren't romantic gifts, they were survival tools. You'd hold them up to your face as you walked through a market or a particularly rank street, like a floral gas mask. Your entire day was one long round of medieval aromatherapy, minus the spa and plus the threat of actual plague. Sometimes, your posy wasn't just in your hand, it was in your clothing. Yes, people sewed flower petals into their sleeves, their collars, even their undergarments. Because if you can't be clean, you can at least smell like you tried. Of course, it wasn't just about masking the stink. People genuinely believed that bad smells cause disease. This was called the miasma theory, and it ruled public health for centuries. The idea was simple: bad air equals bad health. So if the air smelled like rotting eggs and sadness, you were going to get sick. Ender flowers, nature's perfume, and medieval hand sanitizer rolled into one. People stuffed lavender, sage, chamomile, and rose petals into sachets and hung them around their necks, in their homes, and even from their bedposts. Not for romance, no one was feeling sexy with trenchfoot, but to keep the sickness at bay. Some physicians even carried pomanders, small metal or wooden balls filled with strong-smelling herbs and flowers. They'd wave them under their noses while treating patients, like some kind of olfactory force field. You probably recognize the most infamous example of this: the plague doctor mask. Those beak monstrosities weren't just creepy Halloween costumes. The beaks were stuffed with dried flowers and herbs: juniper, mint, rose, myrrh, anything strong enough to drown out the smell of dying humans. Because again, miasma. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. But they tried. And in a way, that's what makes it so human. Speaking of trying, let's talk about flower-based hygiene. We begin with your hair. Shampoo? Not a thing. Conditioner? The closest you're getting is pig lard mixed with rosemary. Instead, people would rinse their hair with herbal water infusions, essentially tea you don't drink. Rosemary, lavender, marigold, and thyme were common choices. Not because it cleaned your hair, really, but because it made it smell less like old cheese. For your skin, there were floral balms, homemade concoctions of beeswax, oil, and flower essences. Rose water was particularly prized. It was used as a toner, cleanser, and in moments of desperation, a poor man's cologne. But the real star of the medieval spa scene? Bathing herbs. Yes, they bathed. Not often. Not well. But when they did, they made it count. A bath wasn't just hot water. It was a broth of blossoms, herbs, and superstition. A typical luxury bath might include chamomile, linden blossom, rose petals, sage, and lavender. Not for Instagram aesthetics, but because each one was believed to have medicinal or magical properties. Feeling anxious? Add lavender. Digestive issues? Toss in some mint. Spiritual impurities from that one time you flirted with a married cooper at the tavern? Better throw in the whole apothecary. And while the poor mostly washed in rivers or not at all, wealthier folk took full floral baths, sometimes 2 or 3 times a year, whether they needed it or not. Let's move on to medicinal flowers, because you're starting to feel a tickle in your throat. And since there's no pharmacy, no ibuprofen, and certainly no WebMD, you do what any reasonable medieval person would do. You panic. Then you go see an herbalist. These were often women, sometimes respected, sometimes feared, often accused of witchcraft if their flowers worked too well. She listens to your symptoms and gives you a poultice made of crushed marigold and honey for your sore throat. She hands you elderflower tea for your fever, mallow for your cough, and foxglove if you're feeling brave and reckless and possibly want to flirt with cardiac arrest. Because yes, foxglove is deadly. But it also contains digitalis, a heart stimulant. And in the right dose, it could save you. In the wrong dose, let's just say the flowers win. It's a risky business, this whole medicine from plants thing. But it's all you've got. And it wasn't just for physical ailments. People believed flowers could heal the mind and spirit, too. Feeling depressed? Try St. John's wort, though it was also thought to ward off demons. So, 2 birds, 1 blossom. Anxious about the upcoming harvest? Burn sage and whisper your worries into the smoke. Crippling guilt from that time you stole a meat pie? Try violets, the medieval symbol of modesty and penitence. In other words, therapy, just with more petals and less eye contact. Now, here's a curveball: flowers as weapons. You wouldn't think it, but several flowers were actively used to cause harm, intentionally or otherwise. Let's talk about monkshood, also known as wolfsbane. Pretty little thing. Purple. delicate, deadly. One pinch in your wine, and you'd be seeing saints within the hour. It was used for hunting wolves, yes, but also for subtle murder, especially by people who didn't feel like stabbing anyone that week. Hemlock, belladonna, and henbane all have lovely blossoms. They also have enough toxins to make your enemies very quiet, very fast. And here's the twist, some of these were used in love potions. Yes, actual poisons in romance brews. Because medieval people weren't looking for a healthy relationship. They were looking for obedience. Belladonna, in small doses, dilates pupils and makes eyes look bright and beautiful. In slightly larger doses, hallucinations, vomiting, occasionally death. You know, romantic. And we haven't even gotten to warfare. During sieges, defenders would sometimes catapult bundles of herbs and flowers over the walls, not to make the enemy sneeze, but to spread disease. Why? Because flowers attract flies. Flies carry rot. And rot carries death. So congratulations. You just weaponized a bouquet. Next time someone gives you roses, think about that. Finally, let's talk about the ritual uses of flowers. Because nothing says sleep easy like ceremonial death blossoms. Funerals were practically botanical festivals. Flowers weren't just for decoration. They were believed to guide the soul to the afterlife and protect it from evil spirits. Certain flowers, like lilies, were reserved for purity and innocence, used in the funerals of children and saints. Others, like marigolds, were used to mourn the dead and fend off ghosts. People believed that the scent of certain flowers would keep demons from reanimating the body. Yes, really. There's nothing quite like floral embalming to ensure Uncle Roger doesn't come back for revenge. And it wasn't just death. Births, marriages, harvest festivals, every major moment was marked with flowers. Not because they were pretty, but because they were necessary. To ward off disease. To encourage fertility. To keep the flies off your ceremonial goose. You roll over in your fragrant flower pile. It's not the worst place you've slept. The scent is starting to calm you now. Beneath the decay and overripe rose water, you can almost detect a hint of time. Your skin itches a little. Probably from the marigold bath you took 6 months ago. But you're alive. You smell passable. And you didn't die from foxglove tea. So by medieval standards, that's a win. You wake up on a battlefield. Sort of. There are no swords clashing, no arrows flying through the air. Instead, there are banners embroidered with delicate little blossoms. Knights polish their armor with the smug confidence of someone about to fight a war over landscaping preferences. You look around, confused. There are flowers everywhere. On cloaks, on shields, carved into helmets. You spot one nobleman wearing what can only be described as a floral bonnet. He looks extremely serious about it. This is not a hallucination. This is not a Renaissance fair gone rogue. You are standing in the middle of the Wars of the Roses, perhaps the most aggressively passive-aggressive conflict in English history. Two rival houses. One white rose. One red. For decades of awkward family dinners, civil wars, and monarchic musical chairs. Let's back up. In the mid-15th century, England entered what historians would kindly call a hot mess, and what participants would call an absolute cluster of crowns and betrayal. The House of Lancaster, whose symbol was a red rose, and the House of York, with their white rose, both decided that, actually, they were the rightful rulers of England. So instead of sitting down and talking about it like rational adults, which, to be fair, no one in history has ever done, they plunged the country into a series of dynastic wars. And somehow, flowers became the branding strategy. Imagine if modern political parties chose their symbols based on whatever looked best in a wedding bouquet. You'd think the whole rose versus rose thing would be elegant, poetic, maybe a little romantic. It was not. It was murdery. You have to understand, medieval people took heraldry very seriously. These weren't just decorative badges. They were identity, loyalty, and threat display, all in one. You'd ride into battle with your family's flower stitched into your tunic, like some kind of violent gardener. And if you wore the wrong flower, you'd be pruning roses 6 feet under. But the Wars of the Roses weren't the only time flowers got political. Let's rewind to ancient Rome, because you know things are about to get extra. Romans had entire floral hierarchies. Flowers weren't just for decoration, they were status symbols, tools of propaganda, and occasionally weapons of humiliation. Take the laurel wreath. It wasn't just a leafy headband for toga parties. It was a symbol of victory, worn by emperors, generals, and anyone who wanted to scream, "I'm better than you," in a way that was both smug and biodegradable. Then there were the roses. Oh, the Romans loved roses. So much so that Emperor Elagabalus, arguably one of Rome's most flamboyant and unhinged rulers, once threw a dinner party where guests were buried alive in rose petals. Allegedly, it was meant to be luxurious and sensual. In reality, it was more like death by potpourri avalanche. Some sources claim people actually suffocated, which raises two questions. How many roses does it take to murder a senator? Who cleaned that up? But even beyond emperors with flower-based murder hobbies, Roman citizens associated flowers with specific political meanings. Certain flowers were worn during triumphs. Others were forbidden at public funerals. Some were reserved for the gods, and using them improperly could get you cursed, fined, or ritually shunned, which, in Roman terms, was basically a slow social death. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and flowers become the medieval version of Twitter hashtags, coded language, virtue signals, and declarations of allegiance. If you were loyal to a queen, you might wear her favorite blossom. If you wanted to shade your enemies without technically committing treason, you could give them a basil garland. In the language of flowers, yes, that was a thing. Basil could symbolize hatred or demonic intentions. Subtle. And then we reach the Tudors, who looked at the whole Wars of the Roses fiasco and said, let's make this even more confusing. When Henry VII, a Lancastrian, married Elizabeth of York, he united the two warring houses. As a symbol of this precious, hard-earned peace, he created the Tudor rose, a combination of red and white. This was more than just a floral mashup. It was branding genius. He slapped the Tudor rose on coins, architecture, portraits, thrones, even bedposts. Every time you saw that two-tone flower, you were reminded, hey, we stopped stabbing each other. Isn't monarchy nice? It was less of a flower and more of a PR campaign. But flowers weren't just for the aristocracy. They were also used by peasants, rebels, and religious dissidents to make political statements, quiet ones, so they wouldn't get their heads removed. For example, in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, some rebel groups used wildflowers like cornflower or poppy to symbolize unity among the oppressed. It wasn't flashy, but it was a way of saying, we exist. And we have feelings. And also rakes. In religious circles, flowers took on sacred meanings that could subtly challenge or reinforce power. The lily, for example, became associated with the Virgin Mary. It represented purity, obedience, and womanhood under divine control. But depending on how you used it, say, painting a broken lily in the background of an altarpiece, you could also be suggesting that society was corrupt or that someone in the church had lost their virtue. It was the medieval equivalent of passive-aggressive art critique. You'd be amazed how many floral arrangements could get you excommunicated if placed incorrectly. And let's not forget the Crusades. Oh, yes. Flowers made their way into that mess too. Knights heading to the Holy Land would sometimes wear flower badges, not because they were feeling cute, but because certain blossoms were believed to offer divine protection. The Jerusalem sage, the rose of Sharon, and anemone flowers were all tied to biblical stories and martyrdom. Wearing them into battle was like bringing holy armor made of petals. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Because as it turns out, flowers do not deflect arrows. But they did make good symbols. And in a world where illiteracy was rampant and messages had to be understood at a glance, symbols were everything. Which brings us to the concept of floriography, the actual language of flowers. This became fully codified in the Victorian era, but the seeds, were already planted centuries earlier. Even in medieval love letters, or more accurately, slightly less aggressive ransom notes with compliments, people used flowers to express feelings they couldn't write out loud. A single violet might mean, I am loyal. A yellow carnation could mean, I'm disappointed in you. And a black rose? Well, that could mean, I mourn you, or I might murder you later. It was all very poetic, and slightly terrifying. But in public ceremonies, flower symbolism could be extremely powerful. Take royal coronations. Certain flowers had to be present: meadowsweet, rosemary, bay leaves, and gilliflower, not because they smelled nice, but because they represented virtues like strength, justice, fertility, and victory. If the wrong flower was used or a key one was missing, people took it as a bad omen. Imagine a whole nation spiraling into panic because someone forgot the lavender bouquet. And speaking of omens, flowers could also serve as divine warnings. Monks recorded stories of blood-red blossoms growing spontaneously after massacres. Entire meadows of poppies were said to appear on old battlefields, blooming where the blood of knights had soaked the earth. Were these real? Probably not. Did they become powerful tools of political myth? Absolutely. Because when you're trying to justify a war, crown a king, or start a rebellion, nothing works better than a ghost flower blooming on sacred ground. Back in your battlefield-turned-garden, you finally sit down. Someone offers you a red rose. You panic. Are they declaring loyalty to Lancaster? Offering you their love? About to poison you? You don't know. You sniff it suspiciously. It smells fine. Maybe a little dusty. And you realize this isn't just a flower. It's a threat, a flirtation, a historical footnote, and a potential political statement all rolled into one fragile bloom. You accept it anyway, because rejecting it might be worse. And besides, it's kinda pretty. You wake up at night, not in your cozy 21st century bed with blackout curtains and the distant hum of your overpriced air purifier. No, you're on a lumpy mattress stuffed with goat hair and existential dread, inside a drafty wooden cottage somewhere in the English countryside around the year 1267. There's no pillow, just a burlap sack filled with straw and possibly a few confused insects. The moonlight creeps in through a crack in the wall. You hear the distant hoot of an owl. And then, a smell. It's not the usual medieval funk, sweat, wood smoke, damp wool, and your neighbor's livestock. No, this is different. It's floral, sweet, thick, a bit nauseating, actually. You recognize it as jasmine or maybe evening primrose. But in the medieval mindset, that smell wasn't romantic. It was deeply suspicious. Because everyone knew that when flowers bloomed at night, it meant only one thing: witchcraft. Or worse. In the medieval world, nighttime wasn't just a time of rest. It was when the veil between realms thinned. Spirits roamed. Demons prowled. And anything blooming in the dark? Definitely not a coincidence. Because unlike normal, sun-loving flowers that bathed in the glorious light of God's skyfire, night bloomers had obviously made a deal with something unholy. So before you get comfortable again, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoyed this weird little journey into floral paranoia. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fun seeing who's dozing off in Kansas and who's fully awake in Kuala Lumpur at 3:37 a.m. with the lights off and a cat sitting on their face. Back to the flowers. Let's start with one of the usual suspects, Datura. Also known as Devil's Trumpet, Mad Apple, or Please Don't Sniff This Unless You Want to Meet God. Datura blooms at night and releases a heavy, intoxicating scent that's frankly delightful if you ignore the fact that it's also highly toxic and hallucinogenic. In medieval Europe, Datura was associated with witches' ointments, those mysterious salves said to help them fly, conjure spirits, or give medieval bishops the middle finger from across the moors. According to folklore, a witch would mix a little Datura with other lovely ingredients like belladonna, hemlock, and mandragora, slather it on her skin, or somewhere more absorbent, and then trip balls while riding a broomstick. Was she actually flying? No. She was tripping in a ditch behind her house while screaming at the moon. But in the eyes of her neighbors, that counted as aerial sorcery. And the night-blooming flowers she cultivated in her garden? Evidence. Proof. Burn the witch. Then there's Nicotiana, or flowering tobacco. This sweet-smelling night bloomer was sometimes grown in monastic herb gardens, but always with a side eye. Monks were careful about it. Because while tobacco hadn't hit full addiction status yet, it would take another century or two for Europeans to get hooked. It was already associated with visions. Smoke it wrong, and you'd see things. Like demons. Or angels. Or your landlord's teeth doing the cha-cha. In places where herbal medicine was just one slippery leaf away from heresy, these plants were considered dangerous. Not because they didn't work, but because they did. Too well. Even the moonflower, a large, trumpet-shaped bloom that unfurls under moonlight, was regarded with suspicion. Medieval texts describe it as having a lunatic influence. In other words, sniff this and you'll end up muttering in Latin while crawling through the cabbage patch at 2 a.m., looking for your shadow. The moonflower's petals were said to glow in the dark, which, in an era without LED lights or scientific explanations, was just straight-up black magic. Of course, much of this fear came from a deep misunderstanding of botany and circadian rhythms. But hey, science hadn't been invented yet. Or rather, it had, but nobody invited peasants to the party. And peasants, by the way, were very wary of night gardens. A night garden might sound poetic today, like something you'd install next to your koi pond and solar-powered pathlights, but in the medieval mindset, it was suspicious as hell. Flowers that bloomed at night were thought to lure spirits, mark cursed ground, act as portals for fairies, the bad kind, or conceal grave-related shenanigans. Because guess what else was common near night-blooming flowers? Graveyards. Yup. Certain nocturnal flowers, like white campion, evening stock, and angel's trumpet, tended to thrive in areas with disturbed or nutrient-rich soil. You know what has both of those qualities? Burial sites. So when people saw white blossoms blooming after dark near an old churchyard, they didn't say, "Oh look, how lovely." They said, "Great. Grandma's ghost is back." Even the scent of night-blooming flowers was suspect. The smell was described in medieval writings as cloying, thick, and suggestive of decay. Basically, if it made your nose twitch at midnight, it was probably evil. This is also where we get stories of flowers waking the dead. No, not in a zombie kind of way. More like a spiritual disturbance sort of deal. Certain flowers were said to stir souls if their scent passed over a grave at the wrong hour. Which, naturally, led to a booming business in medieval graveyard maintenance, a job that mostly involved yanking up suspicious blossoms before they caused any necromantic drama. And if you think this is just village superstition, think again. Even learned scholars of the day, people who wrote in Latin and wore long robes for credibility, were skeptical of flowers that defied the sun. A few clerics argued that nocturnal blooms were the devil's attempt to mimic God's design, a kind of floral counterfeit. That might sound ridiculous, but remember, this is the same era where left-handedness was viewed as suspicious, and eclipses were considered bad omens from Satan's celestial department. So you'd better believe that if a lily opened up at 10:43 p.m. instead of 6 a.m., someone was getting exorcised. Let's not forget belladonna, the pretty name for deadly nightshade. Its glossy berries and violet flowers look innocent enough, but ingesting even a small amount could lead to hallucinations, seizures, coma, or death. It was used in both love potions and poisons. In fact, the only thing it wasn't used for was a nice relaxing bath, unless your goal was to exit your mortal coil via floral aromatherapy. Women sometimes applied belladonna juice to their eyes to dilate their pupils, a beauty trend known as doe eyes. Which is adorable, until you realize they were literally blinding themselves for aesthetics. The medieval response to belladonna: burn it. Burn whoever grows it. Salt the earth. Then burn the salt. But perhaps the most feared of all were plants associated with the moon itself. Remember, in medieval cosmology, the moon wasn't just a rock orbiting Earth. It was a powerful celestial force. And anything connected to it, be it tides, madness, or flowers, was treated with a mix of awe and horror. Silverweed, for example, was thought to bloom under full moons and was associated with prophetic dreams. Plant it near your window, and you might receive visions in your sleep. Or you might be possessed by a wandering saint, or a demon, or your dead Uncle Reginald, still bitter about the family sheep inheritance. The point is, night-blooming flowers weren't just flowers. They were omens, portals, and sometimes agents of chaos. Which is why most people avoided them. No one wanted to explain to the village priest why their herb garden smelled like forbidden knowledge and nocturnal hallucinations. You might get away with growing chamomile. But if your neighbors caught wind of a datura or a moonflower, expect to be on the next cart to the witch trial. That didn't stop some people, of course. The truly daring, usually wise women, herbalists, or reclusive monks with questionable hobbies would cultivate small, hidden moon gardens. They used the blossoms for ointments, vision quests, or to freak out the nobility. Imagine sneaking a few night jasmine blooms into a noblewoman's bouquet. Suddenly, she's having dreams of serpents, bleeding chalices, and her cousin drowning in a lake of honey. Coincidence? You decide. By now, the moon is high. The wind outside is still. Your medieval mattress creaks as you roll over and pull your wool blanket, aka the scratchiest comfort known to man, up over your shoulders. You think you hear a flower blooming outside your window. Just one. Slowly. And for some reason, you can smell it. Thick. Sweet. Familiar. You'll sleep eventually. Probably. You wake up surrounded by the smell of flowers. But this time, it's not springtime in the meadow or a romantic stroll through the Abbey's herb garden. No. This is the heavy, overbearing scent of too many blooms in too small a space. You blink, confused. You're lying in a wooden box. A coffin. Surprise. You're dead. Welcome to your own medieval funeral. Now, don't panic. In this chapter, you're only theoretically dead. Spiritually dead. Emotionally, perhaps. But narratively, you're still here, tucked safely into this oddly fragrant 13th century casket. The good news? You're surrounded by flowers. The bad news? You're surrounded by flowers because you smell like rot and everyone's trying to pretend you don't. Ah yes, flowers and death. A love story as old as decomposition. You see, in the medieval world, flowers at funerals weren't symbolic of eternal life or heavenly passage. They weren't sweet tributes to your beautiful soul. They were there because, bluntly put, your corpse smelled like sin and hot garbage. Let's talk about the smell. Before embalming, refrigeration, or even the concept of soap being used with enthusiasm, the human body decayed quickly, especially in warm seasons. And the medieval church, in all its mercy, had strict rules about burial, usually within 24 to 48 hours. Because after that, let's just say, things got wet. So before we dive too deep into this final floral horror show, go ahead and like the video if you haven't yet, and subscribe only if you enjoy learning about death, dirt, and daisies at 2:17 a.m. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Maybe you're tuning in from Iceland in full daylight, or maybe you're in rural Alabama with a raccoon peeking in your window. Either way, it's always a party. Back to the flowers. You might imagine a medieval funeral as a solemn procession, a few white lilies, a tearful priest. Wrong. Try this instead, a half-dozen sweating relatives in coarse wool, trying not to gag while chanting Latin they don't understand, flinging bundles of herbs and flowers into your open coffin like they're trying to bribe death itself. Because while the modern funeral industry gives us embalming fluid, fragrance-infused tissues, and climate-controlled hearses, the medieval solution was much simpler. Bury it fast and throw flowers at the smell. Let's talk about the kinds of flowers used, and spoiler, they weren't always pretty. First up, rosemary. Rosemary wasn't just a culinary herb. It was the undisputed funeral flower of medieval Europe. Strong-smelling, cheap, and accessible, it was used to mask the stench of decay and symbolize remembrance. You'd find it tucked behind ears, woven into garlands, or literally shoved into the nostrils of the deceased. Nothing says eternal love quite like plugging Aunt Matilda's nose with fragrant shrubbery. Then there was meadowsweet, a flower with a delicate name and a powerful odor-fighting reputation. It has a sweet, almondy smell that medieval folk thought could combat corruption. By corruption, they meant the aromatic meltdown that is a human body left out a few hours too long. Lavender, sage, and hyssop also made regular appearances. Not for their spiritual meanings, but for their pungency. Think of them as the Glade plugins of the 1300s. And for the wealthy, you guessed it, roses. But not the elegant long-stemmed ones you'd find in overpriced vases today. No, these were thorny, overgrown, and typically full of bugs. Still, they were better than nothing. Rich nobles would have roses scattered on their coffins or sewn into their death shrouds. Sometimes, if you were particularly important or particularly smelly, they'd create a death canopy of flowers above your body. You lay beneath it, surrounded by blooms, your decaying form pretending not to exist. Everyone else pretended to. But the award for most ironic flower at a medieval funeral goes to lilies. Yes, lilies, the symbol of purity and resurrection, were frequently placed around the body to disguise the opposite of purity, the pungent, gassy, slow collapse of your mortal shell. It's worth noting that funerals were community affairs, which means the flower selection wasn't just about you. It was about protecting others, spiritually and olfactorily. People believed that the smell of a corpse could carry disease. This brings us to the most infamous flower use of all, plague posies. If you've ever heard the line ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, and thought, what a cheerful children's song, then buckle up, because you're wrong. This nursery rhyme has long been associated, whether rightly or by urban legend, with the Black Death. When the plague swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, killing an estimated 30 to 60% of the population, people did what they could to survive. And what they could do was carry flowers. Specifically, posies, small bundles of fragrant herbs and blooms. People believed that bad smells caused disease, thanks to miasma theory. So carrying a pocket full of strong-smelling flowers might protect you from plague breath. Of course, it didn't work. But it gave people the illusion of control in a world where their neighbors were dropping dead while feeding chickens. Doctors wore bird-like plague masks stuffed with herbs and flowers, lavender, thyme, camphor, anything that might filter the air. These terrifying masks made them look like giant sorrowful crows, flapping from house to house while death clung to their hems. Inside homes, people would hang bouquets of flowers above doors and windows, believing the blooms would purify the air or ward off demons. Churches did the same. So did hospitals. If it smelled floral enough, maybe the angels wouldn't notice the screaming. But even before the plague, people were deeply invested in the smellscape of the dead. Nobility might order flower burials, where the entire crypt was filled with floral offerings. And not just out of love, but to avoid the very embarrassing reality that their corpse was leaking in front of their peers. A real example? The funeral of King Henry I of England. When he died in 1135, his body began decomposing so quickly, thanks to hot weather and some questionable transportation decisions, that the chroniclers described his stench as beyond all understanding. The flowers didn't help. Nothing helped. One monk claimed the smell was a reminder to all kings that even they rot. Beautiful. Poetic. Put it on a t-shirt. Meanwhile, in peasant funerals, the options were fewer. You might get some wild marjoram tossed over you, or a sprig of mint from the garden. The goal wasn't symbolism. It was masking you long enough to get you into the ground without traumatizing your neighbors. That said, even peasants tried to make their graves look nice. Flowers were sometimes planted atop burial mounds, not out of sentimentality, but because some believed that if flowers didn't grow, the person buried there had been sinful. Or possibly undead. Yes, the flowers themselves became judges of character. If a grave sprouted daisies, the soul was at peace. If nothing grew, or only thorns appeared, definitely cursed. Maybe open that grave and check for signs of vampirism. Seriously, in parts of Eastern Europe, flowers, or the lack thereof, were a diagnostic tool for the undead. If your Aunt Blanca's grave refused to bloom, someone was probably going to dig her up and stab her chest with a hawthorn stake. Just in case. Now, let's not forget the symbolism that flower-obsessed Victorians retroactively applied to medieval florals. You've heard of the language of flowers, where every bloom has a meaning: love, sorrow, loyalty, constipation, whatever. Well, in the actual Middle Ages, most people weren't assigning Shakespearean-level metaphors to their dandelions. They just wanted the smell to go away. But monasteries and some well-read clerics did begin associating certain flowers with Christian virtues. Lilies for purity, violets for humility, roses for martyrdom. Not because these flowers smelled particularly good, but because they could double as holy metaphors in paintings and sermons. Imagine a monk saying, "Brother Thomas died in perfect humility," as evidenced by the violets we place by his feet. What he doesn't mention, they also shoved mugwort in Brother Thomas's armpits because he started smelling like a boiled sheep before sunset. Still, over time, the combination of utility and metaphor gave flowers a foothold in funerary practice that continues to this day. Even now, when you go to a funeral, you bring flowers. Not to ward off demons. Not to hide the smell. But maybe, just maybe, because some deep, buried part of the collective unconscious remembers a time when flowers were the only defense against the inevitability of decay. And that's both beautiful and bleak. Kind of like the Middle Ages themselves. You stir gently in your sleep now, still not quite sure if you're alive, dead, or simply dreaming of medieval death rituals and time-scented corpses. Outside, somewhere, a bell tolls. 1, 2, 3 times. You don't need to get up. Not yet. You have time to rest among the rosemary and the rose petals.